The local baker always gave away bread at closing time to anyone in need. One night, a man came by, but instead of taking bread, he handed the baker a photograph of his wife and daughter that went missing 40 years ago and revealed the truth. The small bell above the bakery door chimed softly as Joseph wiped his hands on his flour-streaked apron. It was nearing sunset, and the shop was quiet now, the hustle of the day winding down. On the wooden shelves behind him, a few loaves of bread remained, their golden crusts glowing in the fading light. He could smell the faint aroma of fresh dough lingering in the air, mingling with the sweetness of baked pastries and a touch of cinnamon. It was Joseph Foreman's favourite time of day. At closing, he had a chance to slow down, to pause and breathe, and soon the townsfolk would start trickling in, the ones he'd come to know well, the ones who relied on his kindness. Joseph's evening ritual of giving away bread started years ago. Apart from something he learned with the previous owner, it was a way to connect with others and keep loneliness at bay. He would chat with the regulars, exchange a joke or two, and offer them a piece of his heart, along with the bread. As he arranged the remaining loaves into neat rows, the door creaked open. A young woman with a small child stepped in, her face lighting up when she saw Joseph. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Good evening, Mr. Foreman," she said, her little boy shyly clinging to her leg. "Ah, hello, Maria," Joseph replied, his face breaking into a gentle smile. "And young Samuel. How are you today, young man?" He knelt down to look the boy in the eyes, extending a hand with a small pastry. Samuel's eyes sparkled as he accepted the treat. "We're doing well," Maria said, glancing around the shop. "Thank you again, Mr. Foreman. I don't know what we'd do without you." "Nonsense," he replied, waving a hand dismissively. "It's nothing, just bread." He carefully handed her a loaf, his fingers brushing against the familiar, comforting texture of the crust. "Besides, what am I supposed to do with all this? Can't let it go to waste now, can I?" They shared a chuckle, and Joseph watched as Maria and Samuel walked out, each with their own piece of warmth to take home. Moments like these gave him a sense of purpose, of fulfillment. He straightened up, feeling the familiar ache in his back, a reminder of his age and the years he'd spent here. The door opened again, this time with a soft clink of the bell, and an older man stepped inside. Joseph recognized him as Mr. Green, a retired schoolteacher who often stopped by for conversation as much as for bread. "Good evening, Joseph," Mr. Green said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Have anything left for an old man?" "Always," Joseph replied, pulling a loaf from the shelf. He slid it into a brown paper bag and handed it to Mr. Green. "How's retirement treating you?" Mr. Green chuckled, tucking the loaf under his arm. "Oh, you know, sometimes I think about going back. Those kids kept me young, but I suppose it's time I let the younger folks take over." Joseph watched Mr. Green disappear down the street, the man's figure fading into the dusky evening light. With a sigh, Joseph started tidying up, wiping the counters and sweeping the floor, all the while glancing out the window to see if any last-minute customers might appear. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the bakery was done for the day. He turned towards the door, ready to lock up. Just as he reached for the key, a hand clamped down on his, startling him so much that he nearly jumped out of his skin. He whipped around to find a man standing there, around 30 years old, with a sheepish look on his face. "Sorry, sir," the man said, holding up his hands in apology. "Didn't mean to scare you. Is this Thompson's Bakery?" Joseph took a moment to catch his breath, his heart racing. "Yes, it is," he replied, eyeing the stranger with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "You know, you could try not sneaking up on folks like that." The man chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, sorry about that. I was in a bit of a hurry. I'm actually looking for the owner." Joseph's brows knitted together. "Well, you're talking to him." The stranger blinked, taken aback. "Oh, I thought—" He hesitated before continuing. "I was looking for someone named Joseph Foreman. Is he here by any chance?" Joseph's eyes narrowed. He hadn't heard his full name spoken by a stranger in years. He crossed his arms, a cautious edge to his voice. Let's assume he works here. What's this about? Without another word, the man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a photograph. He held it out, his expression unreadable. Joseph took the photo, his hands trembling slightly as he brought it close to his face. He squinted, the figures slowly coming into focus. His knees gave way, and he sat heavily on the curb, the world spinning around him. He couldn't tear his eyes from the photograph. Suddenly the memories surfaced without warning. He could almost see her, little Lily, standing across the street and holding her mother's hand. And her mother, Joseph's wife, who had stood by his side, sharing the laughter and the warmth of their life. Until that one day, when she didn't. That day she left, taking Lily with her, leaving nothing behind but the scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Joseph had often thought back to those early days when he'd first met Martha. He could still recall the way her laughter rang out, bright and full of life, and how her eyes sparkled when she looked at him. He could recall that day as if it happened just the day before yesterday. His hands were calloused from his work at the mill, his muscles weary from long days spent lifting heavy loads and feeding the roaring machines. Yet, back then, every evening, as he washed up and changed into his best shirt, a new energy filled him. Tonight, like every night for the past few weeks, he'd be meeting Martha. He'd walk down the familiar road to her house, his heart racing with the thought of seeing her smile. Martha's father, Mr. Thompson, never made it easy for him. As soon as he stepped onto the porch, the older man would emerge, his sharp eyes scanning Joseph up and down as if searching for any hidden faults. Joseph couldn't help but feel a flicker of nervousness each time. "You here for Martha again?" Mr. Thompson would say, his voice as firm as his gaze. "Yes, sir," Joseph replied, standing a little straighter. "If that's all right with you?" Mr. Thompson would pause, his silence heavy, like a judge considering a verdict. "As long as your intentions are honourable, Joseph. She's a good girl, and I won't have anyone wasting her time." Joseph had grown accustomed to this exchange, but he always treated it with the utmost respect. It was clear to him from the very beginning that Martha was precious to her father, and rightly so. But Joseph's intentions were as clear as the day he'd first seen her. He'd fallen for her hard and there was no going back. One evening, Joseph decided it was time. He'd saved up his earnings, and though it wasn't much, he'd purchased a modest ring, just enough to show her his sincerity. He clutched the small box in his pocket, feeling its edges as he rehearsed his speech over and over in his mind. He arrived at her door, heart pounding. Martha met him with a smile, her eyes full of the warmth that never failed to calm his nerves. She slipped her hand into his, and they walked, as they often did, down the quiet lanes of their town. "Joseph," she said, glancing up at him with a teasing smile, "you're awfully quiet tonight. Something on your mind?" He took a deep breath, stopping by a grove of trees where they often came to watch the stars. "Martha," he began, feeling his throat tighten. There's something I've been wanting to ask you." Martha's expression softened, her eyes searching his. "What is it?" Without another word, Joseph knelt down, pulling the box from his pocket. He opened it, revealing the small, simple ring, its silver band catching the light of the setting sun. "Martha, will you marry me?" Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in surprise and delight. "Joseph, yes! Yes, of course!" They embraced, laughter and tears mixing as they held each other beneath the twilight sky. For a moment, the world seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them in that pocket of joy. When he walked her back to her door that evening, Mr. Thompson was waiting on the porch, his gaze as piercing as ever. "Well?" the old man asked, arms crossed. Joseph stood tall, his hand holding Martha's tightly. "Sir, I've asked Martha to marry me, and she's agreed. I promise you, I'll take care of her." Mr. Thompson studied them both, his expression unreadable. "You better mean it, Joseph, because if you break her heart, you'll answer to me." Joseph met his eyes without flinching. "I mean it, sir, with everything I've got." The older man's face softened, and for the first time, a hint of a smile crept onto his lips. He extended a hand and Joseph took it, feeling the firm grip of a man who had finally accepted him as part of his family. They exchanged a brief nod before Mr. Thompson patted his shoulder. "You're a good man, Joseph. Don't make me regret this." The couple shared a relieved smile as they walked inside, a new chapter of their lives unfolding before them. Joseph couldn't help but feel as though he'd conquered the world that night, with Martha by his side and the promise of a future together. But little did he know the days ahead would challenge him in ways he could never have imagined. A year later, Joseph and Martha were blessed with a beautiful baby girl they named Lily, bringing a new light into their lives. Their little family felt complete, and everything seemed perfect. Joseph was devoted, embodying all the qualities of a loving husband and father, and Martha found true happiness in the warmth of their growing family. Lily was everything to Joseph. Watching her grow over those 3 years filled his life with a joy he hadn't known was possible. The way she laughed when he lifted her high, the way her tiny hands gripped his fingers, even the way she cried when she was frustrated, all of it had become the rhythm of his days. Martha often teased him about how he spoiled their daughter, but he could see the same sparkle in her eyes that he felt in his heart. That fateful Saturday started like any other. Joseph, Martha, and little Lily took a leisurely stroll through the town square, a weekend ritual they had come to love. The air was filled with laughter and the smells of fresh pastries wafting from the bakery down the street. When they reached the corner, Joseph's eyes lit up. "Stay here, love," he said to Martha, his excitement barely contained. "I'll get us some of those donuts Lily likes so much." Martha smiled, adjusting Lily on her hip. "We'll be right here, waiting." Joseph hurried across the street, feeling a warmth spread through him as he thought about the smile that would light up Lily's face when he returned. Inside the bakery, he quickly chose a box of their favorite glazed donuts, paid the cashier, and practically skipped out the door. But as he looked to where he had left them, his heart sank. Martha and Lily were nowhere in sight. He spun around, scanning the street. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. He began walking around the block, his pace quickening with each step. "Maybe they went to the fountain," he muttered to himself, forcing calm into his voice. But they weren't there. He searched the shops nearby, calling their names, his voice growing hoarse with panic. People began to notice, a few offering help, but no one had seen Martha or Lily. The next 3 days were a blur. He barely slept, wandering the streets, knocking on doors, asking anyone and everyone if they'd seen his wife and daughter. Friends and neighbours helped him search, but there was no trace. The town seemed to close in around him, each passing hour thickening the weight on his chest. A week later, Joseph was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, the room silent but for the ticking clock. He hadn't eaten, he hadn't shaved. His heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest. Just then, the mail arrived. It was an envelope with no return address. His hands trembled as he tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper. The message was short, cruel in its simplicity. "Don't look for us." He read it again and again, his mind reeling. Who had sent this? Why wouldn't they want him to search for them? Driven to the edge of despair, Joseph went to the police. He shared the letter, hoping they could help him make sense of it. But instead of the understanding he'd hoped for, he was met with suspicion. The officers asked questions that turned his stomach, their eyes narrowing as they spoke. They hinted at rumours of fathers who had harmed their families, cases that had shocked the nation. "Now, do you know where your wife and daughter are, Mr. Joseph?" an officer asked, his tone piercing. The accusation hit Joseph like a punch to the gut. "How could you even suggest that?" he choked out, his voice breaking. "They're my family. I would never—" The officers exchanged glances, jotting down notes, their skepticism like a wall between him and any hope of finding Martha and Lily. The very people he'd turned to for help now seemed to believe he was capable of unspeakable things. He left the station that day feeling more alone than ever. The town whispered behind his back, casting sideways glances that stung like 1,000 tiny cuts. He had lost his family, and with it, a piece of his soul. All that remained was the echo of Lily's laughter and the bitter taste of doubt in his mouth, lingering long after he'd walked away from the station. And so, Joseph returned to his quiet, empty home, haunted by the words on that slip of paper and the painful mystery of what had become of his wife and child. Joseph sat in his usual spot on the worn bench near the corner of the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the small bakery across the street, the same bakery where everything had unraveled. He took another swig from the bottle hidden beneath his coat, the burn of the liquor barely registering anymore. It had been 2 years since that fateful day, but time had done little to dull the pain. If anything, the sorrow had burrowed deeper into his bones, gnawing at him from within. Every time he passed this spot, he felt a tug in his chest, as if the air itself remembered the last moments when his life had still made sense. His hands trembled as he raised the bottle again, the alcohol numbing the edges of his grief. But no matter how much he drank, the memories were always there, haunting him, circling like vultures. He could still see Lily's tiny face, her wide eyes, and that innocent smile she gave him before he had crossed the street to buy those damned donuts. He cursed himself every day for leaving them alone, for taking that step away that he could never undo. The sound of footsteps approaching barely registered. People rarely bothered him anymore. They had long since given up trying to pull him from his downward spiral. Joseph could feel their pitying looks as they passed, their whispered words behind his back. He was no longer the man he had been, a husband, a father. He was just the broken shell of someone who had lost everything. And it wasn't just the townspeople who had turned their backs on him. His family had slowly pulled away, their faith in him eroded by suspicion and doubt. They didn't say it out loud, but Joseph knew. They believed the rumors, the cruel whispers that had spread like wildfire after Martha and Lily's disappearance. Martha's parents had been the first to accuse him, their grief twisting into blame. "How could you do this, Joseph?" Martha's father had shouted the last time they'd spoken. "She was our only daughter. Lily was our granddaughter. And you took them from us." Joseph had stood there numb, the words slashing through what little hope he had left. He hadn't fought back. What was the point? Nothing he said would convince them otherwise. The police had asked the same questions, and even though he had begged and pleaded, their eyes had held the same suspicion. Now, the only thing that remained was the bottle in his hand and the memories he clung to with all his might. The only photograph he'd had of his family had disappeared with them, leaving him with nothing but the fading images in his mind. He replayed those memories constantly, afraid that if he let go even for a moment, he would forget the sound of Lily's laugh or the way Martha had smiled at him when he kissed her forehead. As the sky darkened, Joseph's gaze fell to the ground, his breath shallow. He was always here, in this spot, because it was the last place where he felt connected to them. If he moved too far away, he feared that the memory of his family would slip through his fingers like sand. And then, what would he have left? The bottle slipped from his hand, rolling across the ground, but Joseph didn't bother to retrieve it. He leaned back against the bench, staring blankly at the bakery's closed doors. The world around him moved on, but for him, time had stopped the day Martha and Lily had vanished. He mumbled to himself, words only he could hear. "I didn't do it. I didn't take them." His voice broke, a rawness in his throat that had nothing to do with the alcohol. But there was no one there to listen. Not anymore. This time he had drunk so much that he passed out on the ground, oblivious to the world around him. People in town were familiar with his story. While a few offered him sympathetic glances, most hurried past, too accustomed to his presence to take much notice. Lance Thompson, the baker, had just locked up for the evening when he noticed Joseph sprawled on the ground across the street. With a weary sigh, he shook his head, knowing all too well the tragic tale behind this broken man. He approached Joseph, nudging him gently and trying to rouse him. Joseph stirred slightly, muttering incoherent words before slipping back into a drunken stupor. Lance turned to leave, but something held him back. He looked over his shoulder, his heart weighed down by a mix of pity and understanding. Despite his better judgment, he couldn't just walk away. He flagged down a cab and, after a moment of negotiation with the reluctant driver, helped Joseph into the back seat. Ignoring the cabbie's protests, Lance tossed him a few extra bills. Joseph squinted against the morning light streaming through unfamiliar curtains. His head pounded, a reminder of the previous night's indulgence, and he groaned as he sat up. He took in the room around him, clean, simple, with faint traces of lavender and freshly laundered linens. It was a stark contrast to the grimy bench where he usually ended his nights. The faint sound of country music drifted in from somewhere nearby, low and soothing, mingling with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. Joseph's curiosity overpowered his hangover, and he slowly got to his feet, steadying himself against the bedpost. He followed the music, each step tentative as he pieced together the fragments of the night before. He shuffled into the hallway and down toward what he assumed was the kitchen. There, standing by the stove, was a tall man with silver hair and a sturdy build. He was humming along with the radio, his back turned to Joseph as he flipped something in a pan. As Joseph stood there, his eyes fixed on Mr. Thompson's back, anger coursed through him. Here was the man who owned the bakery that had unknowingly marked the end of his life as he knew it. The same bakery whose tantalizing aromas had lured him away from his family that day, the day he could never forget. His fists clenched under the table and his chest heaved with barely restrained fury. For a moment, Joseph envisioned himself leaping and grabbing Mr. Thompson and unleashing years of pent-up rage and frustration. But something stopped him, a flicker of confusion and curiosity. How had he ended up here of all places? As his gaze darted around the unfamiliar kitchen, the tension within him shifted, giving way to a cautious bewilderment. Mr. Thompson turned around just then, a gentle smile playing on his lips, as if unaware of the tempest brewing inside Joseph. "Ah, you're awake. Good timing," he said, carrying a bowl over to the table. "Made some tomato soup. Should help with that hangover." The warm aroma of the soup reached Joseph's nostrils, its scent mingling with the faint remnants of last night's whiskey. He blinked, the anger momentarily dulled by surprise. He hadn't expected kindness from this man, let alone a meal. "Thank you," Joseph murmured, his voice thick with reluctance. He sat down, hesitating for a moment before lifting the spoon and tasting the soup. The flavors, rich and comforting, washed over him, and he closed his eyes, savoring the warmth that filled his belly. They ate in silence, the only sounds in the kitchen those of spoons clinking against bowls and the occasional soft slurp of broth. The kit, though thick with unspoken words, was strangely calming. The fury that had gripped Joseph's heart began to ebb, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He glanced across the table at Mr. Thompson, who sat with a thoughtful expression, as if weighing words that had long been waiting to be spoken. Finally, Mr. Thompson broke the silence. "You didn't do it," he said quietly, his gaze steady and unflinching. Joseph looked up, his spoon pausing midway to his mouth. "What are you talking about?" he asked, a mixture of wariness and defensiveness creeping into his voice. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I'm talking about what folks around here say, about you and what happened to your wife and daughter. They think you did something to them, but I don't believe that for a second." Joseph's heart thudded in his chest. He had heard these accusations whispered behind his back, felt the cold stares of suspicion every time he walked through town. But here, in this kitchen, with Mr. Thompson looking at him with an odd kind of certainty, the words struck a different chord. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice calm and even. "I remember that day like it was yesterday. I saw you picking up those donuts. You were happy, like any man who's about to bring something sweet to his family. I remember the look in your eyes when you came in. That's not the look of a man who's planning something dark. No, that's the look of a man who's got his whole world waiting for him just across the street." Joseph swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Mr. Thompson's words settle over him. "But why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why would you believe me when no one else does?" A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of Mr. Thompson's mouth. "Because I've lived a long time, Joseph. I've seen plenty of liars in my day, and I've seen people who carry pain that's deeper than anyone could understand. You," he said, pointing a finger at Joseph. "You're carrying the kind of pain that doesn't come from guilt. It comes from loss." Joseph's eyes stung, but he held back the tears, his fists clenching and unclenching under the table. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick. "I didn't think anyone would ever understand." Mr. Thompson reached across the table, resting a hand on Joseph's arm. "You've been through more than most, and you've got a right to your grief, but don't let this town bury you in it. You're still here, and that means something." Joseph took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady himself as he wiped away the last of his tears. Mr. Thompson's hand rested firmly on his back, offering a silent reassurance that words couldn't convey. After a moment, Mr. Thompson stood and said, "Come on, Joseph. Grab your jacket. There's something I want to show you." Bewildered but compliant, Joseph followed Mr. Thompson out the door and into the brisk morning air. They walked in silence, the clack of their footsteps echoing through the quiet streets. Finally, they reached the paint shop, and Mr. Thompson led Joseph inside, stopping in front of a newly painted wooden sign. The sign read, "Thompson and Cummer Bakery," in bold, fresh letters, the paint still gleaming. Mr. Thompson turned to Joseph with a hint of a smile. "What do you think? I've been thinking it's time to freshen things up around the place. A new sign, a new start." Joseph examined the sign, feeling an odd sense of renewal as he took in the words. "It looks good. Fresh." "I like it," he replied, his voice still raw. Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "I was hoping you would. You know, I've been working that shop alone for a long time. Gets quiet. And I figure maybe it's time I had some help." Joseph looked at him, the words catching him off guard. "You? You mean me?" "Of course I mean you," Mr. Thompson said, his gaze steady. "I know you're hurting, and I know this place holds painful memories, but maybe, just maybe, it could also be a place for healing. I don't need much from you, just someone to lend a hand now and then. What do you say?" Joseph's mind raced. Part of him wanted to run, to escape the place that had become the source of his torment, but another part, a small but stubborn part, saw an opportunity. He had spent so long on the outside watching life go by that the thought of belonging somewhere again, even if only a little, brought a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. I think I'd like that," Joseph replied quietly. And so at the age of 28, Joseph became Mr. Thompson's assistant. Day by day, he learned the rhythm of the bakery, from mixing dough to kneading bread to listening to Mr. Thompson's endless stories. The old man had a way of making even the simplest tales come alive, his dry humour and quiet wisdom seeping into Joseph's bones like the warmth of a hearth. In the bakery, surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and the steady hum of the oven, Joseph felt a semblance of peace. The memories of Martha and Lily remained, their absence lingering in every corner, but the ache had dulled slightly. He could almost hear their laughter sometimes, faint echoes that didn't sting as much as they used to. As the weeks turned into months, the townsfolk began to take notice. They saw Joseph behind the counter, greeting customers with a tentative smile, and for the first time in years, they saw a man who looked almost whole. And as he and Mr. Thompson worked side by side, an unspoken understanding grew between them, a bond forged not from words, but from a shared resilience and an unexpected friendship. Mr. Thompson never spoke of his own past, but Joseph could sense there was a depth of sorrow there too. It was rare to hear him open up about his past. Most days he was just a quiet, gentle man, always with a warm loaf ready and a story to share with customers. But that night was different. They'd just finished closing up shop, and as the scent of fresh bread lingered, Joseph gathered the courage to ask a question that had lingered in his mind for years. "Mr. Thompson," he began tentatively, "have you ever thought about having a family of your own?" Mr. Thompson paused, a soft smile spreading across his weathered face. But then, just as quickly, the smile faded and his eyes grew distant. "I have a family," he said, his voice steady yet softened by memory. Joseph leaned in, sensing that he was about to hear something that mattered. Mr. Thompson didn't usually talk about his life before the bakery. To most people, he was simply the man behind the counter, always ready with a friendly word and a loaf of bread. But tonight it seemed he was ready to share a piece of his heart. "I was a kid during the Great Depression," Mr. Thompson began, his gaze fixed on the table between them. "I've known hunger like you wouldn't believe. So hungry I even chewed on leather shoes to get a bit of something into my body. When you're desperate, you do things you'd never think you could." Joseph remained silent, his heart aching at the thought. He couldn't imagine what that must have been like. He'd never gone hungry a day in his life. Not like that. "I watched a lot of good folks die during that time," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice growing quieter. "Simple, hard-working folks who didn't deserve to suffer like that. But the worst of it was losing my little sister. She was just 7. Bright-eyed, full of life. I promised her I'd protect her, but hunger doesn't make promises it can keep." Mr. Thompson's eyes shimmered, though he blinked quickly, as if to brush away the ghosts of the past. "Losing her changed me," he admitted. "I was young, but I swore then and there that I'd do whatever it took to help kids like her. I may not have had much, but I could give what I had." Joseph felt a lump form in his throat. He'd seen Mr. Thompson give away bread countless times, always with a smile, never asking for anything in return. Now he understood why. "As I grew older, I realized something. Family isn't just blood. It's who you choose to love and care for. I ended up adopting 12 kids over the years. 12 kids who needed someone. I didn't need to have my own when there were so many who needed help." 12? Joseph echoed, amazed. He'd known Mr. Thompson was generous, but he had no idea just how far that generosity went. Mr. Thompson nodded, his smile returning. "They're spread out all over the country now. Lawyers, teachers, mechanics. Good people. They write to me sometimes, send pictures of their families. I may not have been the best father, but I gave them what I could." Joseph felt a swell of admiration for the man sitting across from him. "You've done more than most people ever could," he said earnestly. "You've given them a chance." Mr. Thompson reached across the table, patting Joseph's hand. "And now, Joseph, it's your turn. This bakery isn't just a place to make bread. It's a place to make a difference. When I'm gone, I want you to carry on this legacy. Keep giving, keep helping. It's the least we can do." The weight of Mr. Thompson's words settled on Joseph like a blanket. He nodded, not fully understanding the task ahead, but willing to take it on. For years, he had wondered why Mr. Thompson gave away so much without expecting anything in return. Now he knew. In the days that followed, Mr. Thompson's health began to decline. Joseph stayed by his side, helping with the bakery, making sure the bread was always fresh, always ready. And when Mr. Thompson finally passed, it was as if the town itself went quiet, grieving for the man who had given so much without ever asking for anything back. One evening, a few days after the funeral, Joseph received an envelope. Inside there was a letter in Mr. Thompson's neat handwriting. "Dear Joseph, thank you for being by my side all these years. You have been like a son to me, and I leave this bakery in your hands. Keep baking, keep giving, and keep loving. You'll find your own way, just as I did. Yours, Mr. Thompson." Joseph clutched the letter, the weight of it mingling with his grief. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he stood up, pulled open the bakery door, and prepared to welcome anyone who might need a loaf of bread and a bit of kindness, just as Mr. Thompson would have wanted. As the years slipped by, Joseph found solace in the routine of the bakery, where the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air each morning. He carried on Mr. Thompson's legacy with pride, and the townspeople began to see him as their own humble hero. In their eyes, he wasn't just a baker, he was a quiet guardian of tradition, someone who never turned away a hungry soul. Over time, the memory of his own family's sudden disappearance faded to a dull ache, like a scar from an old wound. He no longer dwelled on the unanswered questions that had haunted him for so long. Instead, he poured his energy into the bakery. The idea of family transformed for Joseph. His family became the faces of the children who skipped into the bakery for treats, the elderly folks who stopped by for conversation, and the grateful strangers who took bread from him with reverent hands. Until that evening, when the young man appeared at the bakery out of nowhere. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked gently, crouching down beside Joseph. Joseph's hands shook as he held the photograph, tracing the familiar faces he had long believed lost to him forever. Lily's innocent smile, Martha's gentle gaze, it was all there, preserved like a dream he never thought he'd hold again. The weight of the years, of the questions that had haunted him, pressed down, making it almost impossible to breathe. David watched him with concern, stepping closer. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked again, his voice soft but steady. Joseph looked up, blinking away tears as he focused on the young man. Where did you get this photograph?" he managed, barely holding back the tide of emotions surging within him. David's expression softened. "My name is David Larson. The people in this photo, they're my mother, Lily, and my grandmother, Martha." He took a deep breath. "I came here because I was looking for my grandfather. I was told he used to work at Mr. Thompson's bakery. I've never met him, and I wanted to find him." Joseph felt his heart thudding against his chest. The words sounded distant, surreal, like an echo from a memory he had buried deep. He glanced at the photograph once more, then back at David. The realization hit him like a wave, knocking the breath from his lungs. This young man, this David, was his grandson. David paused, glancing at the walls adorned with photos of Mr. Thompson. Are you Mr. Thompson?" he asked hesitantly, his brow furrowing as he looked back at Joseph. Joseph swallowed hard, willing himself to stay steady as he searched David's face. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of connection to something beyond the bakery, beyond the quiet routine of his life. He took in the young man's features. There was something familiar in his eyes, a resemblance that was both comforting and bittersweet. He struggled to keep his composure, but the emotions were too raw, too overpowering. "No," Joseph whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not Mr. Thompson. He was my mentor, my friend." Joseph saw David's eyes widen, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The young man's expression shifted from confusion to a soft, understanding smile, and Joseph could see tears welling up in his eyes. "Grandpa?" David said, his voice breaking as he reached out, hesitant but hopeful. His gaze moved to the wall where Mr. Thompson's portrait hung, the inscription at the bottom confirming his suspicions. He looked back at Joseph, and something in his face changed. He took a step forward, his arms reaching out as he wrapped Joseph in a warm, tight embrace. In that moment, Joseph's resolve crumbled, and he let himself feel everything he had held back for so long. He clung to David, letting the tears flow freely, his body racked with sobs as years of longing, grief, and hope finally found release. He felt David's arms tighten around him, offering comfort, And for the first time, Joseph didn't feel alone. "I've waited for this day all my life," Joseph choked out, his voice thick with emotion. They stood there, holding on to each other, letting the silence fill with the warmth they both had longed for. As Joseph released David from their embrace, he wiped his face, a tremulous smile breaking through. "Lily." "And Martha?" he managed to ask, barely able to get the words out. David's expression softened. "Grandma passed a few years ago," he said gently, his voice filled with empathy. "Mom is actually here. She's staying at the motel just a block away." For a moment, Joseph froze. The reality of Lily's presence, just within reach, seemed almost too much to believe. He didn't say a word, didn't even glance back at David. He simply turned and started walking in the direction of the motel, a familiar landmark in the small town. It was as if his body was moving on instinct, carrying him forward as he tried to process this unbelievable turn of fate. David hurried to catch up with him, his face a mixture of worry and relief. "Grandpa, let me drive you," he offered, but Joseph kept moving, his footsteps firm and determined. He couldn't wait another moment. He had waited a lifetime already. Tears began to spill down Joseph's cheeks, dropping onto the pavement as he walked. Memories of his sweet little Lily, the way she used to run into his arms with that infectious laughter, flooded his mind. All those years of aching to hold her again, to see her face, to know if she was all right, now came rushing back with an intensity he could barely withstand. The years of pain and longing were peeling away, layer by layer as he moved closer to her. And, somehow, amidst the swell of emotion, he felt a twinge of sorrow. Why now, when he had just learned to live with the loss? Why now, when he had finally found a sliver of peace in his solitude? David walked beside him, phone in hand, whispering a few words to someone on the other end of the line. Joseph caught the faintest echo of, "We're coming." When they reached the motel, Joseph spotted a lone figure standing beneath the soft glow of the outdoor light. She was a beautiful woman, her features reminiscent of his own, yet more mature, etched with the experiences of a life he hadn't been there to witness. She stood with her arms crossed, her eyes glistening, and he could see the unmistakable traces of Martha in her posture, her smile. Joseph stopped just a few feet away from her, taking in the sight. He saw her wipe away a tear, mirroring his own emotions. Neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, two souls reunited by fate and time. Then, with trembling hands, Joseph closed the distance, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached out, resting his hands on her shoulders, and felt her warmth, the solid proof that she was real, that she was here. And as he pulled her into an embrace, the dam broke, and he began to cry, the sobs racking his body as he held her close. Lily wrapped her arms around him, and he could feel her shoulders shaking, her own tears mingling with his. The years of pain, the countless nights spent wondering, all flowed out of him in that moment. He felt her gentle touch, the way she held him, as if grounding him in this new reality. There was so much to say, yet no words came, and none were needed. The embrace spoke for him, for the lifetime he had missed, for the memories they had lost and the moments they would now reclaim. They stood together for a long time, holding on to each other, both unwilling to let go. Joseph closed his eyes, letting the weight of his grief dissolve into the warmth of his daughter's arms. Finally, Joseph pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. Lily offered a tearful smile, and he returned it, a peace settling within him that he hadn't known he needed. He gently touched her face as if to assure himself that this wasn't a dream, that this was truly happening. "I'm here, Dad," she whispered, her voice soft yet unwavering. Joseph nodded, his heart too full for words. He took a deep, shuddering breath, one that seemed to carry away all the pain he had held inside for so long. He knew that this was just the beginning of their journey back to each other. Joseph leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together, eyes focused intently on his daughter. He had waited so long for answers, for something that might make sense of the years of anguish and confusion. Finally, he asked the question that had haunted him, that had lived in the dark corners of his mind every single day. What happened, Lily? Why did she leave? Lily drew in a deep breath, her gaze drifting to the faded carpet as she gathered her thoughts. She seemed to be searching for the right words, knowing that whatever she said would either heal or hurt the father who sat beside her. Slowly she began to speak, her voice soft and filled with a mix of sorrow and resolve. When we first left, I was too young to understand much of anything, she began. Mum told me we were going on a trip. I was just a kid, after all. We went all over, different towns, different states, and wherever we went, Mum always seemed on edge, like she was looking over her shoulder. She paused, her eyes meeting Joseph's for a brief moment before they returned to the floor. It wasn't until I was older that she started to tell me things I couldn't understand back then. She said we were being chased, that you were after us, that you wanted to hurt us. Joseph's face tightened, but he remained silent, listening as Lily continued. She said you were angry because I wasn't really your daughter, that I was another man's child, and that's why you wanted us gone. Her voice cracked slightly and she swallowed hard before going on. Mum said not just you, but even her parents were in on it. She made it sound like we had to keep running, or you'd find us and kill us. Joseph's chest tightened, the words hitting him like stones. He'd spent years wondering why they had vanished, imagining the worst. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. I grew up believing she was right, Lily continued, her tone now tinged with shame. For years I thought you were a monster. I never questioned it because it was all I knew. Every time I tried to talk about wanting to go back, she would look at me like I was betraying her, like I didn't understand the danger we were in. And, Dad, she hesitated, the word lingering between them like a fragile bridge. I was afraid of you. Joseph exhaled sharply, fighting to keep his composure. He'd always pictured himself as a father who loved and protected his family. The idea that Lily had spent her entire life fearing him tore at his heart. But when I got older, I started noticing things, Lily went on. Mum would get strange, paranoid, especially if I mentioned dating or making friends. She'd tell me that people couldn't be trusted, that they would betray me, just like you had betrayed us. I never understood why she was like that, but as the years went by, her behavior became more erratic. I thought it was normal, until it wasn't. Lily paused, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. A couple of years before she passed, I finally decided to find out the truth. I started looking into things, researching on my own. I was scared, but I couldn't live in that shadow any longer. I needed to know if you were really the person she said you were. Joseph looked at her, his heart breaking as he waited for her next words. I never contacted you, Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was still afraid. But the more I learned, the more I realized that Mom was unwell. It dawned on me that she'd been dealing with mental illness for a long time, even before we left. I think she genuinely believed what she told me. But as I uncovered pieces of the past, I saw that you had never been the monster she painted you to be. She was running from demons that were only in her mind. Joseph closed his eyes, taking in the enormity of what she had just told him. He had spent so many years searching for reasons, blaming himself, wondering if he had somehow driven them away. And now, here was the truth. A truth that was as tragic as it was freeing. I'm so sorry, Dad, Lily whispered, her voice choked with tears. I'm sorry I believed her, and I'm sorry I stayed away for so long. I was trying to protect myself, but I was only hurting you. Joseph reached over, taking her hands in his. It's not your fault, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You were just a child, caught in a story that wasn't yours to bear. Lily nodded, the tears streaming down her cheeks as she squeezed his hands. Lily had shared the full extent of Martha's story with her mother's side of the family, who, after years of skepticism and doubt, finally understood Joseph's truth. Their acceptance brought a sense of closure and acquittal that had been a long time coming for Joseph, who had carried the weight of suspicion and grief for so many years. As they walked the streets of the small town, Lily marvelled at the quaint shops and the familiar rhythm of a place that felt foreign, but somehow still held echoes of her childhood. David, curious and enthusiastic, delighted in listening to his grandfather's stories and visiting the bakery that had become the heart of Joseph's life. With each step, Joseph felt his heart growing lighter, as if the years of loneliness were slowly fading, replaced by the warmth of family once more. On their last day together, they stood outside the bakery, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the familiar building. Joseph gazed at it, his eyes tracing the contours of the place that had been his refuge. "This is where it all began," he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "I was just trying to get some donuts for you and your mom, Lily. I remember it so clearly. I ran inside, grabbed the donuts, and when I came back, you were both gone. I searched everywhere, but you disappeared." Lily took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. Joseph nodded, his gaze still fixed on the bakery. "Mr. Thompson found me not long after. He saw a broken man and somehow he knew I needed help. He took me in, taught me to bake, and gave me a place to belong. He taught me to be strong, to find peace in the midst of loss." He smiled softly. "I think he knew somehow that this was where I was meant to be." David, standing on Joseph's other side, looked up at him with admiration. "You're the strongest man I know, Grandpa. Mr. Thompson sounds like he was a lot like you." Joseph chuckled, ruffling David's hair. He was a stubborn old man, but he had a heart bigger than this whole town. He always said that peace wasn't something you found, it was something you made. And he made it day by day, loaf by loaf for everyone who walked through those doors. They stood there, the three of them, watching as the last rays of sunlight bathed the bakery in a golden glow. Joseph's heart swelled with a profound sense of gratitude. He had lost everything, yet somehow he had found it all again in the love of his daughter and grandson. He knew that life would never be perfect, that shadows of the past would linger, but he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore.